What if I told you? The war didn't begin with guns and tanks, but with silence, with papers signed in rooms where the curtains were drawn and whispers spoken in languages that carried the weight of empires. What if I told you? The world didn't fall all at once, but inch by inch, as borders blurred, alliances fractured, and the sky began to darken. This was not just a war of soldiers, it was a war of fathers and sons, of broken cities and buried letters, of trains that never returned, and prayers sent into a silence that never answered back. The world called it a war for peace, but behind every flag waved, there was a shadow, a cost, and a secret. This is not just history, it is memory carved into the ruins of Berlin, into the ash of Hiroshima, into the quiet eyes of those who never spoke again. So close your eyes, and fall asleep to the story of how the world tore itself apart and stitched itself back together with trembling hands. If you're new here, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now take a breath and return with me to the battlefields, the bunkers, the silent promises, to the entire history of World War II before the dust had even settled. In the months leading up to June 6th, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were empty and cold, watched only by German patrols and the wind that rolled over the grey English Channel. But across the water, thousands of men were waiting, not just with rifles, but with maps, measuring tapes, pencils, typewriters, and supply forms that had to be signed in triplicate. The invasion of Normandy, known to history as D-Day, would become one of the most dramatic days of the Second World War. But for those who planned it, it was less about glory and more about numbers, miles of wire, tons of fuel, and the precise amount of waterproof socks needed to keep men alive on a foreign coast. The man who never left the beach was not a commander or a general. His name, like so many others, is lost in the creases of forgotten documents. But for this story, you can imagine him as a quartermaster clerk, the kind who wore glasses under his helmet and carried more pencils than bullets. He landed in the second wave, not to fire, but to count, to build inventory in sand, to organise chaos, and to ensure that what came ashore, from stretchers to socks, didn't vanish with the tide. The planning for Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allied invasion of Western Europe, had begun over a year earlier. In 1943, even as battles raged in the deserts of North Africa and the cities of Italy, a different kind of war was being waged in meeting rooms and warehouses. The Allies needed not just soldiers but scaffolding, the invisible structures that would hold the invasion together. That meant fuel depots, medical stations, food rations, and spare parts for vehicles that hadn't even landed yet. British and American. Planners met in places with names like Southwick House and Norfolk House. Their chalkboards were filled not with battle plans, but with tonnage calculations. For every soldier, 3 pounds of food per day were needed. Multiply that by 150,000 troops, just for the first 24 hours. Multiply again for horses, vehicles, and the possibility that the beach might not be taken by sunset. This was not strategy. It was grocery shopping on an apocalyptic scale. The quartermaster services drew maps of supply flow instead of front lines. They asked hard questions. How many gallons of petrol could be carried in a floating tank? How many stretchers could fit in a landing craft next to crates of rifle ammunition? If a soldier's boots got soaked, how long until trench foot began to set in? These weren't dramatic decisions, but they were decisive, because every forgotten item could mean a ruined mission or a dead man. Behind every uniform was fabric, every bullet needed grease, and every landing required an artificial harbour, something called a mulberry. These massive floating concrete ports were towed across the channel and sunk into place. Their pieces were designed months earlier in secret coastal yards. Welders and shipwrights who never fired a shot contributed more to the invasion than some who did. As D-Day approached, so did the paperwork. An army moves on its stomach, but it also moves on requisition forms. Soldiers who would storm Omaha Beach received briefing packets that included not only maps but menus. The clerks had ordered canned beans by the ton, medical gauze by the mile, and steel helmets that had to be reshaped for radio wires. The invasion's success would be measured not only by beachheads but by balance sheets. And still, the man who would never leave the beach was just a line on a manifest. His job was not to kill or conquer, but to confirm delivery. On the eve of D-Day, while generals polished speeches and paratroopers whispered prayers, He checked his clipboard. Tin mugs, morphine vials, spare tyres, shovels, tarpaulin, chalk rope, and the most important cargo of all, the white flags to mark off the zones where the dead would be buried. The early morning of June 6th came not with silence but with a tremble. Thousands of ships crowded the waterline. The first waves of infantry hit the sand and many never stood up again. But in the chaos behind them, men like the clerk came ashore not with rifles, but with boxes. They waded through blood and brine, holding ledgers high over their heads. Theirs was a different kind of war, one where accuracy, not aggression, would mean victory. By noon, the first makeshift depots were set up behind hastily dug trenches. Beachmasters, officers who directed supplies, waved flags and shouted orders in a language made up of numbers. 557 to red 2, sandbags to green 4, crates were sorted with painted stencils. Some were misdelivered, others exploded. But slowly, the system held. The man who never left the beach began logging shipments within an hour of landing. He didn't see the hedgerows beyond the dunes. He didn't fight in Caen. He wouldn't march to Paris, but he knew which box held clean blankets, and he knew how to count bullets faster than most could fire them. He was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, who didn't write history but made sure it had enough pencils. As the sun began to set on that longest day, many of the frontline troops had moved inland. But others remained behind, building out the landing zone. Bulldozers pushed sand, engineers laid down metal matting for tanks, and clerks like our man stacked crates in the fading light, listening to the distant rattle of gunfire that drifted in from the hills. For them, this wasn't a day of victory, it was the beginning of a very long inventory. And so we ask, what does it mean to fight in a war if you never fired a shot, but made sure everyone else could? The beach did not empty after D-Day, it transformed. What had begun as a narrow foothold of blood and fire became something far less cinematic, a warehouse without walls. Over the next days and weeks, the sands of Normandy were buried not just under boots, but beneath layers of infrastructure. Canvas tents became sorting stations. Piles of wooden crates rose into hills. Truck engines idled all night as unloading continued in rotating shifts. This was no longer just a battlefield, it was a staging ground for the rest of the war. The man who never left the beach, still anonymous in records but unforgettable in his quiet role, began to take on new duties. He had arrived to manage inventory, but now he found himself embedded in the life of the supply chain. His ledger had grown thicker. Every item had to be tracked across time, not just space. Each crate received was penciled in and marked. Each item sent forward was crossed out and traced. There were no second chances here. A missed delivery might mean no morphine for a medic, no fuel for a tank, or no food for a platoon camped beside a hedgerow. In the quiet hours between shipments, when the fog rolled in and the waves softened into whispers, he could hear other things. The distant cries of wounded men still being evacuated, the mechanical cough of generators powering field radios, and sometimes the rustle of pages from other clerks like him, catching up on forms under dim lantern light. These were the sounds of a different war, one not waged with weapons, but with patience. A war of flowcharts and fuel logs, one in which the smallest oversight could cascade into disaster. The sand under his feet changed. It hardened where trucks had passed, soft where new gear was dropped. He came to know the terrain like a storeroom, the ridge where engineers set up water purifiers, the inlet where vehicles got stuck in mud, the stretch of beach where the cold kept corpses unburied for too long, every part of it etched into his routine. And yet, he never wandered far. His world measured only a few hundred yards, but within that space history moved, pallet by pallet, barrel by barrel. By the second week, the artificial harbours had arrived in full. Mulberry A and Mulberry B, hulking slabs of floating concrete assembled in astonishing time. They became the veins through which supplies would now surge. His job shifted again. With the arrival of these structures, there came new logistics, new routes, new weights, new problems. Some cranes broke under the burden of oversized tanks. Others jammed with salt-clogged ropes. Every malfunction was logged, every delay explained. There was no glory in this, but there was responsibility. Once he helped coordinate the delivery of blankets for wounded troops waiting on Red Beach. Another time it was crates of rubberized canvas, crucial for waterproofing foxholes as rain set in. Once, by accident, he opened a misrouted crate and found it full of musical instruments, meant for a USO unit still docked in England. He closed it quickly and labelled it again, non-priority. Entertainment. Even the absurd had to be catalogued. Nothing was allowed to vanish, not even trumpets in a war zone. Letters came infrequently, not just to him, but to anyone still stationed along the shoreline. Mailbags arrived soggy, stamped with unfamiliar towns where field post offices had been hastily set up. He read one letter from a woman in Illinois, asking her son if he was warm enough. The boy had died the week before, hit by shrapnel while helping unload a truck. The letter was forwarded anyway. Someone had to read it. The clerk placed it gently in a waterproof pouch and wrote on the envelope, "Deceased. Notify next of kin." Then he returned to counting carbines. Time on the beach was measured differently. Days were not marked by dates, but by arrivals. The day the canned meat ran low, the day the radio spools tangled, the day they ran out of socks. His own feet blistered in wet boots. There was no room in supply for spares. He wore the same pair until the heels thinned and the seams opened. Still, he logged the inventory. At night, the sky sometimes glowed orange from artillery flashes inland. Planes passed overhead without ceremony. Occasionally, the German Luftwaffe would drop a single bomb, not to destroy but to disrupt. One explosion shattered 2 crates of iodine and twisted a truck's axle. The next day, he rewrote the requisition forms by hand because the typewriter ribbon had snapped. There were no spares for that either. New faces arrived, some fresh from England, others reassigned from other fronts. The beach was a fluid place, a temporary outpost in a war that had no patience for permanence, but he stayed. When asked if he wanted reassignment, he declined, not out of bravery, but habit. He knew the patterns now. He had memorized which tent held the tire chains, which corner kept the ink for marking crates, how long it took for bread to mould in the salt air. To leave would be to start over. He didn't want to learn a new chaos. He began to write his own log, separate from the official one, a journal, though he never called it that. In it, he described the smell of cordite after a distant barrage, the way soldiers laughed too hard after coming back from the front, then fell silent as they ate, the small ritual of tearing off the tops of ration cans, which became ashtrays or tiny basins for shaving. He logged the ordinary, the nothing, because someone had to remember it. The war moved forward. Paris was nearing, Rome had already fallen, and yet on the beach shipments still arrived, soldiers still passed through, Clark still worked late into the damp night, and our man, still with his clipboard, still in his original uniform patched 3 times, still logging shipments under dim light, remained. As August approached, rumours began to circulate. New ports had opened, larger depots were being built inland. The beach, their strange little city of canvas and crates, would eventually be dismantled. The man who never left the beach would be asked to move. But where does someone go who has learned to live in the in-between? What happens when your war was never about conquest, but about keeping other men alive long enough to do the conquering? By September, the tide of war had rolled past the beaches of Normandy and deeper into the European interior. The front lines were no longer defined by sand and steel matting, but by winding country roads, burnt-out villages, and forested ridges where battles shifted by the hour. Paris had been liberated. The news echoed across the camps like a gust of remembered joy. But for the man who never left the beach, celebration was measured not in champagne or flags, but in the arrival of fewer crates marked urgent medical. The artificial harbour, once a marvel of ingenuity and defiance, now creaked with rust. Its floating sections groaned under fewer loads each day. Some of the engineers who built it had already moved on to construct bridges across the Seine, and yet the paperwork kept coming. Updates to the depot's manifest, late deliveries from England, and replacements for parts that had worn out not from war but from constant use. Even in retreat, logistics had a stubborn gravity. Nothing could be abandoned without a signature. The beach itself had begun to fade. The sounds of artillery were more distant now. The wounded had thinned to a trickle. The floodlights, once burning all night to unload ships, were dimmed. Each evening fewer trucks rumbled in. The depot tents stood like forgotten shells on a shore that no longer remembered its purpose. Yet the clerk remained, as constant as the tide. He had become part of the beach, his footsteps worn into the hardened earth, His small station a fixture among sagging poles and empty crates. He wasn't forgotten. Higher command knew his name now, not for heroism, but for consistency. His reports were never late, his inventories never off. When asked why he had not requested transfer inland, his answer was simple. Everything I know is here. And it was true. He knew which crates had been mistakenly marked rations, but actually held replacement carburetors. He remembered which stretch of sand was too soft for heavy tyres, even months after the engineers had said otherwise. He could walk the supply yard blindfolded. The war had changed around him, but he hadn't changed with it. Then one day, a new order arrived, stamped in red ink. The beach depot was to be closed. The remaining supplies would be consolidated and moved to Cherbourg. The clerks, engineers, and mechanics still stationed on the shore would be reassigned, their work deemed complete. For most, this was relief. For him, it was something else. The quiet end to a life built in sand and steel. He didn't fight the order, but he delayed his packing. There were still loose items, stray tools, spoiled rations, torn tarps that could still be mended. He spent one final week walking the perimeter of what had once been the most important piece of real estate in the war. He logged each remaining object, no matter how small: an abandoned lantern, a bent shovel, a half-full drum of motor oil. All were accounted for, not because someone demanded it, but because someone needed to finish the story. On his last day, he stood alone on the ridge above the beach. Below, waves crashed against the shore where the first bodies had fallen months earlier. The tide had washed away the blood, the boots, the debris. But somewhere beneath that sand still lay fragments of helmets, of wheels, of torn documents blown from the hands of men now buried elsewhere. History had marched forward. He had stayed behind to clean up after it. When he boarded the final truck bound for Cherbourg, his uniform looked almost out of place. Sun-bleached, salt-stained, and patched with more care than style. He carried no rifle, just 2 ledgers, one official, the other personal, and a folded letter from a mother he never met, whose son's belongings he had packed with care. No medals adorned his chest. No one saluted as he left. The beach emptied without ceremony, and yet the war would not have worked without him. Because wars are not won only by those who advance, but by those who ensure the advance does not collapse under its own weight. The beaches of Normandy became symbols of sacrifice, of courage under fire, but they were also platforms of paper, grease, and careful handwriting in stormy weather. They were kept alive not just by blood, but by inventory. Months later, in a depot farther inland, a young recruit flipping through an old supply log would pause on a name written neatly on every page. He'd never heard of the man, but the numbers matched. The shipments were precise, and the system still worked. That recruit would fight in the Ardennes. He would eat from crates that arrived because of a system that held, even when the men who built it had vanished into silence. So perhaps the real question was never who fought hardest, but who made the fight possible and then quietly stepped away. When the soldier who never left the beach finally stepped away from Normandy, the war was already somewhere else. But not everyone could follow its front lines. Some simply waited, in shadows, in cellars, under iron sheets nailed into soil. While the war advanced across Europe, it had already passed over others in different ways. In London, it came from the sky. The sirens began as a whisper, distant, high-pitched and hollow, then escalated into a wail that fractured silence like glass. For Londoners, that sound was a kind of second clock. The first told them when to go to work. The siren told them when to go underground. Some heard it while drinking tea, others while bathing, some while cradling children. It interrupted meals, letters, arguments, and dreams. It was not a sound of fear anymore, it was a command. The war had come to England long before D-Day. During the Blitz of 1940-41, German bombers lit the capital with fire, turned historic buildings into ash, and sent thousands into makeshift shelters that were never meant to house lives. The air raid siren had one task: erase normalcy. And in doing so, it introduced something else, a kind of underground culture of waiting. Time was measured not in hours, but in the space between sirens. Life for many was lived in that gap. The man who had managed crates in Normandy once knew the weight of rations in tons. But in London, it was the sound of footsteps on the staircase to the shelter that told another story. Mothers clutching ration books, grandfathers carrying tin kettles, children dragging blankets behind them like shadows. The war here was not fought with rifles, but with patience and small comforts. One of the largest public shelters was beneath a disused underground station. Hundreds descended into it nightly. The walls were damp, lined with old advertisements now stained by mildew. The air was thick with breath and boiled cabbage. Each family staked their own claim on a corner, laying down bedrolls beside strangers. Privacy had ceased to be a right. Here, silence was a form of mercy. The shelter had its own rituals. A bell rang when the all-clear sounded. Volunteers passed around enamel cups of weak tea. One man, a retired schoolteacher, read from Shakespeare every night at 7:15. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he needed to believe routine still mattered. Children played card games. Some men, still in soot-streaked uniforms from working above ground, would sit quietly and smoke, their eyes fixed on the ceiling that quivered with each distant explosion. Not everyone stayed calm. There were those who sobbed quietly in the corners. Others, especially newcomers from the countryside, flinched at every rumble. Once a young woman screamed for 3 hours, unable to stop. The others did not shout at her. They simply moved their bedding farther away. Emotional space was the only luxury they could still afford. Illness spread easily. Colds lingered for weeks. Lice were combated with powders that smelled like rust and vinegar. Babies cried at odd hours. But still, they came. Because above ground, it was worse. Buildings collapsed with no warning. Firestorms devoured entire blocks. And the sound, the drone of enemy bombers, was like thunder tied to metal wings. You didn't hear them until it was already too late. The shelters developed a strange etiquette. People did not ask each other's names unless it was necessary. There were nods, familiar glances, and unspoken rules about space and sharing. But deep friendships were rare. Life was too unstable. To grow close was to risk loss. It was safer to be polite, distant, kind, and temporary. News from the front arrived slowly. Whispered updates passed between hands like bread. Allies took Caen. Patton's tanks crossed the Seine. There's a new type of bomb, rocket-propelled. But these facts felt foreign, distant, as though describing another planet. Here, in the cold gut of the city, people did not think about tanks. They thought about water dripping from the ceiling, about damp wool, about the small comfort of a dry biscuit. Above, the war left different scars. Streets were cratered. Bricks lay where bedrooms had once been. Londoners emerged from shelters each morning into a different city than the one they had left behind. Some found their homes flattened. Others found familiar shops burned black, and still they cleaned up, swept glass into buckets, helped each other rebuild doors, mended what could be mended and mourned what couldn't. One boy, aged 10, had a notebook he carried everywhere. He recorded every raid in precise handwriting, the time the siren sounded, the number of seconds it took to reach the shelter, and what he heard outside during the night. 4 distant booms, 1 whistle, screams, couldn't tell how many he did not flinch as he wrote. This was his way of surviving. Quiet documentation, a record of shadows. Not all shelters were beneath the ground. Some were in back gardens, corrugated metal half-tubes called Anderson shelters, half buried in earth and lined with old carpets. Others crowded into church crypts or basements of schools. Every available crevice became a refuge. The earth became a second roof, and yet no one thought this would be their life forever. Each night felt like a chapter in a long book that had to end. But the chapters kept coming. The sirens kept sounding. The shelters filled, emptied, and filled again. People clung to hope not with speeches or songs, but with habits. Repacking the same bag each day, laying the same blanket, kissing the forehead of a child in the same order. This was not defiance. It was maintenance, and always the question, when will it stop? They never asked it loud. They asked it with their eyes, with the long pauses after each all clear, with the way they lingered on the ladder before climbing back into a world that no longer looked like home. The war was moving east, but for those who lived beneath the sirens, it felt like it had never moved at all. In the early mornings, when the all-clear sounded and the city exhaled its breath, people emerged like ghosts, not triumphant survivors, but caretakers of a broken world. The shelter's damp stone walls gave way to the cracked streets of London, familiar in their outlines but altered in their details. A chimney missing here, a shop front blasted away there, a new crater filled with rainwater where a bakery once stood. The night had made its edits, and each morning the residents stepped into the margins. The man who had once kept records of crates on a French beach would have understood this quiet labour, the daily work of recovery, of order-making in the face of ruin. But Londoners were not counting bullets or barrels. They were counting windows that still had glass, books that hadn't burned, and neighbours who still answered when their names were called. The war for them was not just an event, it was a condition of life, like rain, like fog, like hunger. The shelters, once seen as temporary necessities, had begun to feel permanent. The underground station was now layered with the marks of its inhabitants, initials scratched into walls, makeshift shelves nailed into beams, a children's chart showing days without bombing, never able to climb past 3. Even laughter, rare, sudden, and often brittle, became part of the space. One girl, no older than 7, had taken to naming each incoming raid as if they were mischievous visitors. "Here comes Mr." "Bumpy again," she would say, as the walls shuddered under distant concussions. Above ground, civil defence workers cleared rubble with wheelbarrows and bare hands. Women carried bricks like groceries. Men with bandaged arms repaired utility lines in silence. The enemy's goal had been terror, but the effect was different. Fatigue layered over routine. The city did not scream, it endured. Quietly, relentlessly, with patched shoes and chipped mugs and pockets full of ration coupons. At the shelter, medical volunteers treated everything from gashed legs to croup. There was no real triage, only whoever cried the loudest or bled the most. Supplies were thin. Once, a nurse had to dress a wound with torn curtain lace. Another time, an elderly man died during a raid, not from injury but from heart failure. They wrapped his body in a wool blanket and left it respectfully in a corner until sunrise. No one spoke much about it. Death was not strange anymore, only inconvenience. Some days it rained so hard that water poured through the stairwell and formed a shallow pool in the lower corridor. Children splashed, through it barefoot, giggling, while adults worried quietly about disease. The shelter's air thickened with the scent of wet cloth and kerosene lamps. Those who could afford it brought small candles, preserving matches like currency. Light was rationed in more ways than one. People found methods of distraction. A factory worker named Harold brought a chessboard made from cardboard and used buttons for pieces. He played every night, alone or with others, keeping track of wins in a little black book. A woman named Margaret crocheted scarves from unravelled jumpers, then gifted them to children without asking names. Even in the depths of a war they didn't choose, some chose to give. Rumours floated in like leaves from another world. Someone said the Americans had invented a bomb too big for a plane to carry. Another whispered that the king had considered evacuating London completely. Neither claim mattered much. People still boiled water in dented kettles and tightened belts around empty stomachs. For most, the war was not shaped by breakthroughs or speeches. It was shaped by whether the next raid would hit closer than the last. One night, the sirens didn't sound, and the bombs came anyway. The mechanism had failed, or someone had made an error, and the shelter filled late. Half the usual crowd had already been asleep in their homes. The shockwave from the nearest explosion shattered the glass covering the shelter's emergency instructions. Plaster fell like dust from the ceiling. A child screamed. The old teacher, who usually read from Shakespeare, was injured by flying debris. He never returned after that night. The absence of warning changed something. People began to arrive earlier, long before any sirens, sometimes before sunset. They brought more with them. Not just blankets, but photo albums, family heirlooms, loaves of bread wrapped in wax paper. The shelter wasn't just refuge, it was becoming a second home, a bunker for memory. Outside, the city was learning to cope with absence. Families who had lived together for decades now carried keys to empty houses. The corner store closed without ever announcing it. A church's roof collapsed, but services continued on its lawn, even in rain. The idea of rebuilding was always present, not in speeches but in hammer strikes and bandaged hands. They were already reconstructing even before the bomb stopped falling. The war was moving east. That much everyone knew. But its departure was not sudden. No army knocked on the shelter doors and declared peace. The sounds simply changed. Fewer engines overhead, fewer booms after midnight. A silence that, at first, was more frightening than the noise. Because in silence, people had to remember. The boy with the notebook kept writing, but now he included more than raid counts. He began noting the names of the people who had once shared the benches beside him. Mrs. Hargrove, always knitting. Gone after raid 21 Tommy with the tooth gap. Moved to Birmingham Mr. Russell, loud snorer. No one complained, each name was a story. Each absence a quiet loss. As the shelter emptied more often, those who remained looked around and realised how much space there had once been. How crowded the benches used to feel. There was room now, but no one wanted it, and so they waited again. But this time not for sirens. They waited to believe the war had truly moved on. When the war's thunder began to fade, it did not leave behind a celebration. It left behind a hum, a low, quiet vibration that echoed in the places people had once gathered for survival. Not to fight, but to endure. In London, the shelters were no longer full, but they were not forgotten. Those spaces beneath the city, carved out of fear and necessity, became echoes of everything that had been held inside them. The breathless nights, the whispered prayers, the soup passed between strangers, the pages turned slowly in the dark. For weeks, even after the bombings had all but ceased, some continued descending the narrow staircases at dusk. Not because they expected danger, but because they didn't yet trust peace. The ground above still bore the bruises of war. Buildings hunched like wounded animals, lampposts bent toward rubble, curtains fluttering in window frames with no glass. The city was not silent in the way a meadow is silent. It was the silence of something stunned. In the shelter, dust settled on benches that once sagged beneath bodies. A child's drawing remained pinned to a post, its crayon edges faded. The chessboard was still there, but the button pieces had scattered. Only a few came regularly now. A widow who always brought the same metal flask, a teenage boy who sat where his father once had before being conscripted, and the girl who used to name the raids, now quiet, eyes wide, her sense of playfulness packed away like a winter coat. But something had shifted. Even the absence of fear could feel hollow when it came too late. One evening, the boy who'd once kept meticulous notes stood and read a list aloud. Names, dates, places people had once sat. He didn't cry. He didn't explain. He simply recited, then closed the notebook and left it on the ground, as if gifting the shelter a memory it couldn't write on its own. Outside, the cleanup had become a second war. Not against an enemy, but against collapse. Bricks were repurposed from ruined walls. Wood was salvaged from half-fallen staircases. Families moved into homes that had no roofs but still had chimneys. Children played among skeletons of buildings, chasing one another through doorways that no longer led to rooms. The government issued posters declaring victory, but the people of the shelters didn't cheer. They mended. They swept. They climbed slowly back into their lives. VE Day came and went. Parades danced through the streets, but in the shelters there was only silence and the creak of wood. Not everyone had returned, and not every name had been written down. One of the shelter wardens, a man who had once organised head counts each night, who had memorised the location of every first aid kit and flashlight, began to clear the place one evening, not with force, but with ritual. He folded each remaining blanket, he extinguished every lamp, and before locking the gate for the final time, he placed a handwritten note at the foot of the stairs. To those who waited here, we remember. Some shelters were repurposed. A few were sealed off, forgotten under layers of concrete and new construction. Others were turned into museums, their benches polished, their stories told on plaques. But many remained untouched, slowly crumbling into the bones of the city. Below pubs, schools, shops, places where life moved on, lay the ghost outlines of spaces that had once been cities within the city. And even in the years that followed, there were those who, when hearing the faint rise of a siren from a passing ambulance, would pause. A flicker of instinct, a muscle memory, a glance toward the ground, toward a place that had once meant safety. Decades later, a writer, perhaps once a child who slept beneath those flickering lights, wrote in a quiet column that history had missed something. That the war had not only been fought with tanks or on beaches, but in silence, in shelters, in stolen minutes of rest, in the stubbornness of ordinary people who refuse to vanish, and somewhere, in a depot still holding rusted crates from another time, a ledger bearing the name of a clerk who never left the beach still sits on a shelf. His lines of numbers, the faded names of canned goods and bandages, aligned strangely with the quiet rosters kept in shelters under London, both incomplete, both essential. Because war does not remember only those who fight, it also belongs to those who wait, and when peace comes, it does not knock on every door. Some must go out to find it. Others stay behind, wondering what peace is supposed to sound like after a lifetime of sirens, before a single tank rumbled across a border, before any uniform was issued, before even one bullet was loaded into the chamber of war, there was paperwork. And in Berlin, paperwork ruled like a silent general, issuing commands not with rifles but with rubber stamps. While the London shelters echoed with footsteps descending into the dark, and the beaches of Normandy drowned in the logistics of steel, deep in the heart of the Reich, a different kind of engine churned, one made of memos, dossiers, applications, requests and signatures, mountains of them, tall enough to bury conscience. In peacetime, the German bureaucracy had been known for its precision. Trains that ran on time, records filed alphabetically and chronologically, floor plans labelled with military geometry. But during wartime, this same machinery became something else entirely. Every movement of the Nazi war machine, from troop deployment to food rationing, from deportation lists to factory quotas, passed through layers of clerical approval. War for them began at the desk. In a sandstone building tucked behind Wilhelmstrasse, one of hundreds like it, rows of typists clacked away for hours, turning orders into formalities. The building smelled of ink and glue. Its corridors echoed with the shuffle of boots and the creak of leather briefcases. A junior administrator named Gerhardt, not yet 30, hair already thinning, glasses always fogged from the radiator's heat, had never fired a weapon. But each morning, he sat at his desk with a stack of requisition forms and his Reich-issued pen, writing requests that would echo across the Eastern Front. He didn't consider himself political. He wore no swastika pin on his lapel. His job was simple: confirm inventory reports for ammunition supplies to Wehrkreis 5, Military District 5, and file corrections when trains derailed or shipments vanished in Polish snow. He didn't ask where the bullets were going. It was not his department. On some days, Gerhardt filed documents that dealt with the boots. How many pairs had worn through in the previous month? What brands had the highest failure rate? Whether the heel iron standard needed revision. These were his wars, fought not in trenches, but in margins. He signed off on requests to redirect leather shipments from civilian factories to frontline infantry divisions. He annotated complaints from officers about blood-stiffened soles. To him, it was a question of efficiency, nothing more. But the numbers were never just numbers. Each crate he approved, each barrel of oil rerouted from Prague to Leningrad, moved soldiers, moved death. Like the soldier who never left the beach, Gerhardt never saw the combat zones. But unlike that soldier, he never once questioned the system he served. Not because he believed in it, but because he feared losing his desk more than he feared being wrong. All around him, Berlin was shifting. Buildings were fortified with sandbags. Civil defense drills became routine. Blackout curtains darkened entire neighborhoods. The war felt closer, but in the offices, it remained distant, a matter of updated policies and increased quotas. The real battles, Gerhardt told himself, happened elsewhere. His war was measured in carbon copies and delivery receipts. One floor above his department, a different kind of paperwork was being processed. Lists of names, entire families, citizenship reclassifications, transportation schedules that never returned. But the same machinery moved them. Forms, stamps, signatures, the same desks, the same pens. Sometimes Gerhardt glimpsed the men from that floor. Sharper uniforms, tighter silence. He never asked what they did. He didn't want to know. Averted eyes are also a kind of ink. As the war expanded, so did the bureaucracy. New offices opened overnight. Departments restructured. Every factory. Requisition had to be cross-verified with fuel allotments. One week, Gerhardt worked 12-hour days just to reconcile conflicting records between artillery inventory logs and logistics updates from Silesia. He was praised for his diligence. "You hold the system together," his superior said once. He nodded, smiled faintly, and returned to his stack. In reality, he felt trapped, not by ideology, but by familiarity. He knew the flow of forms better than he knew the streets of his own city. He knew the exact tone of the typewriter when its ribbon ran low. He could recognize the sound of a misfiled folder before even seeing it. And in that small dominion of paper, he felt safe. Outside, Berlin was beginning to fray. Rations grew tighter, train schedules grew erratic, and the whispers about defeats, about disappearances, about entire divisions swallowed in Russia, crept into the margins. But inside the office, everything remained orderly. The Reich prized efficiency even in collapse. Then came the day a shipment report returned with a note. Supply loss due to enemy sabotage. Casualties. 46 Gerhardt paused. 46 men perhaps lost because a shipment of ammunition had not arrived in time, a shipment he had approved late because he had wanted to finish early for once. The words supply loss did not mention the names, but he thought of boots, lined up in mud, without bullets. That night he walked home slower, past a bakery now closed for months, past a poster peeling from the wall, "Victory is discipline." He thought about the shelter dwellers in London, the ones he had read about in passing, people who had no desks, no ink, only courage and cold hands in the dark. He thought of them not with sympathy, but with confusion. He couldn't imagine a life not filed, not structured, not stamped. But war does not reward paperwork, it only consumes it. His department would eventually burn as Allied bombs turned entire blocks of Berlin into rubble. His files would scatter into alleys, his typewriter would melt into slag, and no one would remember which shipments he had signed off on, or which forms he had triple-checked to perfection. And yet, the war had passed through his hands, quietly, relentlessly. So what does it mean to participate in a war where the weapon is not a gun, but a pen? The corridors of the Reich ministries had a rhythm, footsteps echoing against marble floors, doors opening and closing in perfect intervals, the hiss of pneumatic tubes delivering sealed packets through walls like veins pulsing in a living machine. This was the sound of a system that believed in itself, not because it was righteous, but because it was orderly. And in that order, men like Gerhardt had found shelter from chaos, even as chaos swallowed Europe inch by inch. After the soldier on the beach had catalogued his last crate, and while London's shelter walls cooled with silence, Berlin's inner offices remained, strangely untouched. Even as bombers began to circle above the capital, the bureaucratic heart kept beating. Papers signed, files shuffled, columns totaled. The war was not yet lost on paper. Loss, after all, didn't compute easily into statistics. A miscounted casualty could be corrected. A missing shipment could be rescheduled. A country in flames could still be quantified by how many ink cartridges remained in stock. Gerhardt, now more senior, had been promoted to oversee regional supply chains. His job was no longer confined to boots or bullets. It encompassed everything from uniforms to soap rations to the repair parts for vehicles never destined to return. His signature was needed on dozens of documents daily, his initials becoming their own kind of authorization. But with the promotions came exposure. He now reviewed reports from areas marked not by unit numbers, but by initials that needed no explanation. KL, Concentrations Lager. It was in these files that the boundaries between military and extermination began to blur. Requisition requests for camp expansions, cement shipments diverted from hospitals, quotas marked with chilling precision, arrivals, processing times, resource output. In the margins of one form, Gerhardt noticed a phrase he could never forget. Labour potential, diminishing, recommend transition. No names, no places, just a line of suggestion written in impersonal type. He stared at that phrase for hours. What did transition mean when there was nowhere left to send them? What did labour potential mean when it referred to starving, nameless humans, forced into ash-grey uniforms with no seams? He showed the paper to no one. He did not ask, he filed it. Not because he agreed, but because that was what was done. He began to smoke more. The ink on his fingers never washed out completely. And though he still arrived at work on time, still checked every figure twice, something had changed in him. He stopped bringing lunch. He ate less. He He stopped attending the weekly morale meetings, citing illness. When colleagues joked about the resilience of German efficiency, he smiled faintly and returned to his paperwork. Outside, Berlin shuddered under nightly raids. Buildings once filled with clerks collapsed into brick skeletons. The ministry staff was scattered across alternate sites. Schools, abandoned hotels, half-empty train stations converted into makeshift record centres. Files were transported in crates, pushed on carts down bombed-out streets. Still, the system insisted on functioning. If a report was delayed, it was not the bomb that was blamed. It was the courier. By early 1945, Gerhardt had begun falsifying documents. Quietly, carefully, rewriting figures to misreport train capacity, rerouting shipments toward empty destinations, delaying deportation manifests by days. He told no one. There were no grand statements, no whispered confessions. He simply adjusted numbers. It was the only form of resistance he understood, not protest but distortion, ink in the cogs. Sometimes he wondered if it mattered, if slowing a train by 2 days changed anything in a world already drowning. But he kept doing it, because it was the only thing left that let him sleep. He began marking altered pages with a dot in the corner, a tiny signature only he could read, a flicker of conscience in black. Then, one morning, his supervisor was arrested. Not because of ideology, but because a report was 10 hours late. The machinery was no longer patient. It had turned inward, consuming itself. Fear replaced hierarchy. Loyalty was no longer enough. Only usefulness mattered. Gerhardt said nothing. He destroyed the remaining marked documents, burned the ledgers he had doctored. When questioned about the errors, he blamed low staffing, poor ventilation, confusion in transfer protocols. He was believed. Or perhaps he was simply no longer important enough to punish. In the last weeks before Berlin fell, his office was relocated to the basement of a building that once sold musical instruments. The shelves still held violins, shattered by shrapnel, strings snapped like nerves. He worked by candlelight, filling out requisition forms for gasoline that no longer existed, for troops that had already been lost. Still, the forms had to be filed. And then came the silence. The phone lines went dead. The pneumatic tubes stopped whispering. The last bundle of forms he submitted was returned unopened, marked simply, "No further processing necessary." Gerhardt sat in the cold for hours. He had nothing else to do. The building above him had been hit days earlier. Smoke still drifted through the ceiling vents. But no one came to evacuate him. No one told him the war had ended. It simply stopped arriving at his desk. In that moment, he realized the thing that had terrified him most was not the war's violence. It was the collapse of the system that had shielded him from it. The structure was gone. The order dissolved. There were no more forms to process, and without them he no longer knew who he was. Because when war is built on paper, and the paper burns, what remains? The war ended not with a letter, but with the absence of one. Gerhardt, once a cog in the towering machinery of Reich bureaucracy, sat at his desk in silence for the final time. Outside, Soviet artillery had chewed the horizon into dust, and the streets of Berlin were no longer governed by sirens, but by silence between bombardments. His inkwell had dried days earlier. The typewriter ribbon had snapped. His forms were no longer stamped. They simply sat in piles, unsent, unread, unneeded. He stayed because he didn't know what else to do. The city around him crumbled with slow finality. Columns of smoke climbed like question marks over ruins. Apartment windows that once glowed with evening light were now hollow sockets. The tram lines hung useless over cracked streets, their power long severed. There was no longer a chain of command to report to, no central directives. And yet, even in that vacuum, Gerhardt came back each day, sweeping glass from his small workspace, sorting papers that no one would file, adjusting schedules for deliveries that would never arrive. The soldier on the beach had left behind his ledgers. The families in London had emerged from their shelters to rebuild. But Gerhardt had nothing to emerge from, because the structure he'd built his entire identity around no longer existed. There were no orders, no lists, no envelopes, no labels, just quiet, and the memory of obedience. It was in that memory that he finally began to understand. The war had never been about ideology alone. It had thrived on process. on forms that didn't ask questions, on men who did their jobs without wondering where their signatures were leading. In the final weeks, the building he worked in became a shelter of sorts. Civilians, women, elderly men, shell-shocked teenagers in tattered uniforms, began to take refuge in its basement. There were no supplies, only shelter from falling debris. Gerhardt instinctively organised them. He cleared space between filing cabinets, laid down blankets scavenged from storage rooms, tallied food, even when the tally meant recording zero. It was all he knew. One evening, a woman brought her young daughter into the room where Gerhardt had once filed requisitions for fuel. The girl's shoes were mismatched. Her cheeks were hollow. She wandered over to his desk where stacks of obsolete paperwork still sat and asked, "Are you a teacher?" Gerhardt shook his head, then paused. "No," he said, "but I used to keep track of things." The girl stared at the dusty forms and asked, "Did the papers tell you who was going to live or die?" He didn't answer, because they hadn't said it out loud, but they had whispered it, between line items, between units and quotas, between transit and arrival. And Gerhardt had heard those whispers, even if he'd never admitted it. He'd buried them in decimals and abbreviations. The system had made it easy. In the final days of April, as Soviet troops closed in on the city, Gerhardt burned the last remaining documents, not in an act of sabotage, but of surrender. He did not want to preserve what those papers meant. He stood over a metal bin in the courtyard and fed them in one by one, watching the stamps melt, the orders curl, the signatures vanish into smoke. He kept only one sheet, a blank requisition form, unsigned, unmarked, unstained. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, a symbol, perhaps, of a man whose war had never left the office. When the city fell, no one came looking for Gerhardt. He wasn't on any list. He had no rank, no military decorations. He was not a name history remembered, and yet, like thousands of others, he had moved the war forward in invisible ways, not through blood, but through bureaucracy, through silent complicity. In the years that followed, Berlin rebuilt. Streets were repaved, statues were toppled, replaced, argued over. And in certain forgotten basements, people found old filing cabinets, rusted but intact. Inside were records that led nowhere, names faded by mould, whole lives reduced to numbers. One historian later wrote that the most terrifying thing about the Nazi regime was not how loud it was, but how quietly it functioned. The most deadly tools were not tanks or guns, but the forms that moved unnoticed between offices, passing judgment in triplicate. Gerhardt lived out his years in obscurity. He never worked for another institution. He taught arithmetic to children in a rural town where he never spoke of Berlin. He never touched another typewriter. But some nights, when the air was too still, he would unfold the blank requisition slip he had kept all those years. And he would wonder what kind of world might have been possible if more people had simply refused to fill theirs in, because perhaps the final stamp isn't found at the bottom of a page, but in the silence of someone who chooses not to lift the pen. Long before the first shot was fired in World War II, military planners on all sides had already begun another war. Not one of bullets or borders, but of calories. War, after all, is not won solely by strategy or courage. It is carried forward by the stomachs of millions, and by the silent machines that fill them. As Berlin's clerks stamped fuel permits, and London's families emerged cautiously from the shadows of their shelters, another quiet army was already at work behind the scenes. The cooks, chemists, quartermasters, and logisticians who had to answer the unglamorous but urgent question, how do you feed a global war? To understand how much a soldier can carry, you must first understand what they eat. A combatant on the front line might burn over 4,000 calories a day, sometimes more in winter or in the mud-churned agony of retreat. That's more than double what a civilian needs. But calories were not just nourishment, they were morale. In the trenches, a hot meal could mean the difference between a man standing his ground or collapsing in exhaustion. And in the brutal cold of the Eastern Front, food was often the only thing separating survival from frostbitten death. The war's many fronts brought different challenges. In North Africa, supplies spoiled in the heat. In Italy, convoys stalled on narrow bomb-riddled roads. In Russia, food froze solid in the hands of the men who needed it most. And across all these landscapes, one thing remained constant. The meal had to be portable, cheap, calorie-dense, and shelf-stable. From this crucible emerged a quiet invention war rarely credits: the modern combat ration. In Germany, rations were divided by role and necessity. Frontline troops received the iron ration: tins of preserved meat, hard biscuits, a small pack of coffee substitute made from roasted acorns or chicory, and sometimes a single sugar cube. It was not meant to satisfy, it was meant to sustain. Behind the lines, men might be issued the Marschverpflegung, or marching rations, which included dried vegetables and the infamous Ersatz, substitute foods created from whatever scraps remained: sawdust flour bread, synthetic fats, even protein pastes made from processed bones. Hunger made these edible. Pride made them tolerable. Across the Channel, the British field ration was more generous in its ideal form: bully beef, biscuits, canned beans, tea, sugar, and plum jam. But in practice, it depended entirely on supply. On the front, soldiers might go days without a hot meal, subsisting instead on dry, chalky biscuits that could crack teeth, or the ubiquitous tinned meat, greasy, dense, and unrelenting in its sameness. Troops joked that they could identify units by smell alone: curry, if Indian forces were nearby; burnt bread and tea, if it was the British; and for the Americans, meat and chocolate. American innovation brought with it new categories: the K ration, for mobile troops; the C ration, for standard meals in the field; and the D ration, a high-calorie chocolate bar so dense it could break a man's teeth if eaten frozen. These meals came in cardboard boxes with items like processed cheese spread, powdered lemonade, and gum. Soldiers often discarded half the contents, bartered the rest, or created culinary improvisations like foxhole stew, a mixture of everything edible thrown into a helmet with hot water and hope. But none of these meals existed without the backline efforts of thousands of workers who would never see a battlefield. Factory women packed millions of cans by hand. Chemists experimented with preservatives. Shipping coordinators calculated calorie-to-weight ratios. A single miscalculation in packaging could lead to spoilage on the journey, and a spoiled ration could become a death sentence on the line. Rations were not just about logistics, they were psychological tools. A warm cup of tea in a trench could briefly transport a man back to his kitchen table. A piece of chocolate, even stale, could evoke memories of peacetime birthdays. Soldiers sometimes carried unopened rations in their packs for weeks, not because they didn't need them, but because the contents represented something stable, something ordinary, something unbroken. And yet, feeding an army was never equal. Colonial troops, conscripted labourers, and auxiliary units often received less, or worse. In some German-occupied territories, forced labourers survived on bread rations that delivered barely 600 calories a day. In Soviet gulags, where political prisoners were drafted into war work, the daily meal might consist of little more than watery soup and a crust of bread. Malnourishment became policy. In these spaces, food was no longer sustenance, it was leverage. Meanwhile, in besieged cities like Leningrad, starvation became a weapon of war. Civilians tore wallpaper from walls to boil the starch from the glue. Family pets disappeared first, then books were burned for warmth, then even belts and shoes were chewed when there was nothing else left. And through all of this, the official rations, 125 grams of bread per day at the siege's height, were recorded, distributed, and enforced with bureaucratic precision. Back at the front, soldiers grew creative. They learned which local ingredients could be foraged or stolen. They traded cigarettes for eggs, soap for butter. In occupied France, Allied troops paid children in chocolate bars to fetch bread from farmhouses. In the Pacific, GIs hunted coconuts, fished with grenades, or bartered with locals when jungle rations fell short. One Marine once wrote home, "If the bullets don't get me, the spam will." But through all these improvisations, the pattern held. Without food, the machine broke. Troops couldn't march, tanks couldn't move, and morale evaporated like water in a mess tin left too close to the fire. Feeding the front became a campaign all its own, invisible, unthanked, but indispensable. And so we must ask, if a war can be starved to a halt and survival measured in mouthfuls, why do history books so rarely mention the cooks? War did not wait for mealtimes, but it required them nonetheless. After the crates were counted and the cans distributed, after men like Gerhardt signed off on weight-to-calorie charts in Berlin and soldiers unloaded shipments on the beaches of France, someone still had to cook. Someone still had to light a flame in the wind, stir pots with shaking hands, and ladle out hot food under the smell of cordite. Across every front, meals were improvised in impossible conditions, and though most will never know their names, the war was fed by cooks. The field kitchen, or Gulaschkanone as the Germans called it, the goulash cannon, was a wheeled iron stove dragged behind a truck or horse, a weaponless piece of equipment as vital as any artillery. On the Eastern Front, it became a lifeline for freezing infantry. At night, its chimney would puff silently in the snow, a signal as dangerous as it was comforting. Soldiers huddled around it not just for heat, but for a thin soup made from dried potato flakes, cabbage, and meat scraps scavenged from the last delivery. Sometimes, a cook would stretch a batch by adding sawdust bread or boiling the bones twice. The men never asked how. They were just grateful for something warm. British mobile kitchens were little better. Converted lorries with dented pots and soot-blackened kettles that travelled just behind the line. Their crews were composed of cooks pulled from hotel kitchens and farmhands, trained hastily to serve battalion-sized meals under fire. They boiled tea by the gallon. Tea that tasted of metal, of burnt leaves, of the war itself. But it was hot, and it reminded men that home still existed, even if it lived only in steam. In the Pacific, feeding the front was a trial against heat, rot, and distance. Jungle air ruined everything. Canned meat swelled and split. Flour clumped with moisture. Rice moulded faster than it could be soaked. American engineers built makeshift field kitchens under tents, using scavenged metal as grills, stoking flames with palm fronds. GIs would sometimes eat directly from mess kits with one hand while holding their rifles with the other. There were no breaks, just pauses between exhaustion. Feeding such vast armies demanded not only courage but ingenuity. Supplies moved in convoys that stretched for miles, vulnerable to ambush, mud, or miscommunication. The term supply line sounds neat in textbooks. On the ground, it meant soldiers unloading crates in waist-deep water, or navigating trucks across roads bombed into ruin. In one case, on the Italian front, a mule train carrying flour was lost when a shell startled the animals and sent them over a cliff. That night, the regiment had nothing but tea and hard biscuits. No one complained. Complaints were wasted breath. Cooks became tacticians. They learned how to disguise the taste of a rot, how to scrape every edible particle from a pot. They knew which soldiers to feed first, the scouts, the machine gunners, the radio men, and which units could survive a delayed meal. They memorized calorie counts better than they ever learned rank structures, and sometimes they lied, called a meal beef stew when it was little more than broth, carrots, and optimism. No one blamed them. Illusion had become a part of nourishment. But even behind the line, the kitchen was never safe. Bombs didn't discriminate. In Normandy, a single airstrike obliterated a British cookhouse just hours after it served 300 men. In the Ardennes, field kitchens were camouflaged under branches and hidden in ditches. Still, smoke betrayed them. And when artillery found them, it didn't just kill soldiers, it starved units. Food was also used to discipline. A soldier caught stealing rations might be assigned to kitchen duty, not as punishment, but to remind him how fragile the system really was. One missing crate could ripple across an entire battalion. One miscounted tin could mean hunger for 20. A cook had to account for every spoonful. Even waste had to be logged, documented, explained. Yet food also created strange moments of peace. On Christmas in 1944, a temporary ceasefire allowed German and Allied cooks in one small Belgian town to share space, not as allies, but as men trying to give their units a warm meal. They cooked on opposite ends of a barn, separated by language and suspicion, but joined in purpose. The meals were simple: potatoes, tinned meat, broth. But for those who ate, it was a reminder of something deeper, that beneath uniforms, hunger was the same. In liberated towns, civilians often shared what little they had. A woman in Sicily once cooked a vat of lentils for passing British troops. She had lost her husband and son to bombing raids, but she boiled those lentils anyway, served them to strangers, then sat and watched in silence. One soldier wept quietly as he ate, not from grief, from taste. It was the first non-rationed food he'd had in 3 months. In the chaos of retreat, from Tunisia, from Normandy, from Stalingrad, food became memory. Soldiers abandoned crates they once protected with rifles. They buried emergency tins in the dirt for those who might follow. In retreat, meals were no longer scheduled. They were scavenged, stolen, or forgotten. Hunger began to unravel the machine, and when an army goes hungry, it begins to lose not just strength, but direction. By 1945, millions had been fed, and many more had starved. The war's statistics include troop numbers, casualties, tanks destroyed, but they rarely mention the cans opened, the loaves baked, the broth stirred by trembling hands. They do not count the cooks who died feeding men who never remembered their names. They do not list the villages that burned after surrendering their grain. And yet, the war was moved by food. So if you could follow a single loaf of bread from field to flour, from ration list to trench, from mouth to memory, what kind of story would it tell? As the war dragged toward its closing chapters, the role of food took on new dimensions. No longer just sustenance, but strategy, survival, punishment, and in some cases, final defiance. The soldier on the beach, the family in the shelter, and the clerk buried beneath a fortress of files, all had relied in one way or another on an invisible chain of meals. But in the final years of World War II, the control of food became more than logistical. It became political. Hunger was wielded with intent. And for millions, starvation became not a risk of war, but its central weapon. Nowhere was this more horrifyingly clear than in the concentration camps. Food there was not rationed. It was rationed away. The daily meal in many camps consisted of watery broth, a crust of bread no heavier than a fist, and a bitter herbal tea that offered no nutrition. Prisoners bartered crumbs like currency. They learned to swallow slowly, to chew what wasn't meant to be chewed. If lucky, a spoonful of margarine. If not, just silence and the ache of emptiness. Survivors would later say the hunger didn't just erode the body, it rearranged the mind. It narrowed every decision to a single axis: eat or wait. Some broke, others resisted. In one camp, a group of prisoners organized a secret kitchen, not to cook, but to remember. They would sit together and describe meals from before the war in exquisite detail. Roast goose, warm bread, stew so thick it held the spoon upright. They called it eating with memory. And somehow, in that act of collective imagination, they fed something that starvation couldn't reach. In besieged cities like Warsaw, food became folklore. Entire families survived off potatoes grown in broken windowsills, soups made from weeds and old onions, cakes baked from ground acorns and boiled newspaper starch. Children learned to forage before they learned to read. In some cases, mothers gave up their share entirely, feeding only their children while pretending to be full. They died smiling. In Japan, toward the end of the war, the imperial military's hunger reached such extremes that soldiers resorted to eating pine bark. In occupied territories, rice became a precious myth, spoken of more than eaten, and even among the victorious Allied troops, hunger followed them into the final months. The farther they marched, the longer the line stretched, the thinner the supplies became. In the Ardennes, surrounded and frozen, some American units were down to half rations of crackers and canned meat. In Burma, British Indian troops marched until their uniforms hung loose on bone. Food wasn't a luxury, it was a countdown. But in all this, something else happened too. Something quieter, easily lost beneath the thunder of battle. Even in hunger, people shared. A nurse in a Soviet field hospital gave away half her rations every night to patients who couldn't swallow. An Italian partisan stole flour from a fascist outpost and baked bread for children hiding in the hills. A German soldier retreating from the Eastern Front found a starving Polish boy on the roadside and gave him the last of his chocolate bar. The boy lived. The soldier didn't. And when the camps were finally liberated, when the gates swung open to reveal skeletal survivors in striped uniforms, the first gesture made by many Allied troops was not a salute. It was food. Cans of condensed milk, pieces of bread, dried fruit. But even this had to be done carefully. After years of starvation, the human body cannot handle sudden abundance. Some liberators, desperate to offer help, gave too much too quickly, and people died from the shock of nourishment. Doctors learned to reintroduce food slowly, carefully, a spoonful of broth, a single biscuit. Then wait. The body had to be convinced it was safe again, that the war had passed. In the years that followed, recipes from wartime were passed down like heirlooms, not out of pride but out of remembrance. Victory cakes made without sugar, bread from barley husks, tea brewed from dandelion roots. These dishes tasted of resilience. They became a way to tell the story of survival without needing words. Soldiers wrote home about their favourite rations, not because they tasted good, but because they tasted familiar. Civilians recreated recipes from memory, reviving the flavours of a time that had almost been erased. In one rural village in France, an elderly woman kept the tin her son had sent home during the war, empty but polished, resting on the mantel. She said it reminded her that he was still alive when he mailed it. That was enough. War devours. It eats cities, families, years. But those who lived through it learned that hunger is more than absence. It is memory. It is ritual. It is defiance. To eat in war is to declare that you intend to live. And so, long after the fires were extinguished, and the ledgers stopped printing and the sirens fell silent, one truth remained. The war had passed through stomachs before it passed through streets. So perhaps the final question is not who had the biggest army or the most tanks, but this. Who was able to keep feeding others, even when they had almost nothing left themselves? By the time the last camp was liberated and soldiers began to return home with haunted eyes and hollow cheeks, there were parts of Europe where no one returned, not because they had died, but because the path back no longer existed. Roads could be rebuilt, bridges replaced, but there were railways, entire veins of steel that simply vanished. Not forgotten, not erased, just gone, as if swallowed by the war itself. Their timetables never resumed, their destinations never reopened, and for those who once rode them, only silence remained where the whistle used to cry. The war had been carried on tracks. Troops were moved by train. Ammunition and fuel rode flatbeds. Children evacuated from cities clutched cardboard tags around their necks as steam engines pulled them into countryside exile. But perhaps more than anything, it was the trains that moved the victims. Deportation lists were executed in columns of cars. Boxcars became tombs, and across Eastern Europe, railways once designed for industry or commerce were rerouted for extermination. But before all that, they were just trains. In 1938, before the invasion of Poland, the line between Lviv and Krakow was one of the busiest in the region, a lifeline for farmers, traders, families, and students. Villages dotted its length, each with a wooden platform and a schedule chalked on a board. Conductors knew passengers by name. Postcards arrived with the image of the train printed on them. It was not romantic, just reliable. And then, almost overnight, it became a corridor for soldiers, then tanks, then silence. As German forces swept through Poland, these tracks were commandeered, expanded, militarized. Stations were retrofitted with barbed wire and signal towers. Platforms were rebuilt not to accommodate passengers, but cattle cars. Timetables were rewritten in coded ink, destinations labelled with initials like T2 or EK, Treblinka, Extermination Commando. Whole trains departed without official records. Those who watched them leave knew they would not return, and soon those stations emptied. Some engineers refused to drive. They were executed. Others obeyed, telling themselves it was just a job. Some cried at night. Others found solace in precision, a well-oiled engine, a tight schedule. One driver, arrested in 1946, confessed that he had memorized the number of breaths it took for the train to reach full steam. He never counted the people inside. In Romania, entire branches of rail line were removed and relaid to serve labour camps tucked into the mountains. In Hungary, railways were fortified to support the rapid deportation of tens of thousands of Jews in the final phase of the Holocaust. And in Ukraine, Soviet troops tore up entire lines during retreat, leaving towns cut off and surrounded, their rails twisted into useless scrap. The railway was more than a tool, it was an accomplice, but like all tools, it left behind evidence. When the tide of war reversed and the Red Army pushed westward, they found trains abandoned mid-journey. Some still attached to their cargo, skeletal remains and tattered clothing scattered across wooden floors. Others were burned. There were platforms with no towns left, tracks that ended abruptly in forest clearings, telegraph wires severed, switchboards broken. And yet, even as the war's violence subsided, those trains did not resume their routes. After the war, rail ministries attempted to restore the network. Track crews were sent out to repair twisted rails, raise signal towers, replace decayed sleepers. But in some places the lines were simply gone, buried by new development. or grass, or shame. In towns where everyone had been taken, Jews, Roma, political dissidents, prisoners of war, the station remained, but the train did not. The whistle no longer echoed between hills, and the maps were redrawn. In Slovakia, villagers whispered of trains that passed at night, long after the war had ended. They said the tracks were cold in the morning, the way they only got when heavy iron had passed over them. No one could explain it. No schedules existed, and yet some claimed to hear the rumble in the distance, always just after midnight. Decades later, historians would discover partial records, manifests without totals, transport orders with the names scratched out. Survivors would describe the journeys. 3 days without food, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, no windows, no air. They would remember the screech of the brakes, the sudden halt, the creak of the door before the shouting began. But not all ghost trains were haunted by death. Some simply vanished. During the chaos of 1945, one German freight train filled with confiscated art and documents disappeared near the Tatra Mountains. Its final station reported departure. Its next station never received it. No wreckage was found, no logs discovered. It became a local legend, the missing train of the Reich, filled with stolen culture and state secrets, buried perhaps under a landslide or beneath a collapsed tunnel. And then there were the trains that kept running, even after the war had ended, but for reasons no one wanted to talk about. In Soviet-controlled territories, trains carried prisoners to labour camps well into the 1950s. The platforms bore no signs, the conductor said nothing. The towns along the route dared not look. Today, many of those lines are gone, ripped up for scrap, swallowed by forest. The ties decayed, the iron rusted. But if you walk along their path, through the underbrush, past the remnants of stone platforms, you might still find a spike here or there, half buried in the soil, a silent memorial to a journey no one volunteered for. So what does it mean for a railway to disappear? Not just the metal, but the memory of where it led. There's something about a railway platform that makes it feel expectant, a place designed for comings and goings, for hellos and last goodbyes. Even when empty, it waits. Concrete slabs stained by years of soles and wheels still echo with imagined footsteps. But across Eastern Europe, after the war had passed and borders were redrawn, thousands of platforms were left in permanent pause. Stations that once bustled with freight and laughter now stood mute, holding their breath for trains that never returned. In Hungary, near the village of Baja, there was once a station built with arched ironwork and mosaic tile floors. Before the war, it served merchants, students, and families on holiday. It saw birthdays and returns from university, soldiers leaving for the front, and newlyweds catching the 712 to Budapest. In the summer of 1944, it saw something else. Boxcars filled with human cargo, guarded by rifles sealed from light. They came quietly in the early hours, when the town was still asleep. By morning, they were gone, and the station never recovered from the sound of silence that followed. Many of these ghost stations were not destroyed. They were simply bypassed. After the war, new tracks were laid to reflect the political landscape. Lines that once flowed freely from Vienna to Krakow were interrupted by new borders, new regimes. Trains that had moved in graceful loops now stopped at checkpoints, redirected through less volatile corridors. But in rural towns, where war had emptied the population and erased entire communities, no one came to build detours. The platforms remained, weeds growing through their cracks, clocks stuck at irrelevant times. In Poland, remnants of wooden benches still sit beneath overgrown shelters. Metal signposts, rusted but legible, mark destinations that no longer exist. Towns absorbed into larger cities, or renamed by post-war governments, or annihilated by flame. Children growing up nearby ask their grandparents what the trains were like. Sometimes the grandparents lie. Sometimes they don't answer. Some stations became shelters. Refugees, wandering after the front collapsed, camped beneath canopies built for travellers. Displaced persons from dozens of ethnicities, Ukrainians, Jews, Hungarians, Germans fleeing the Red Army, found themselves huddled on platforms that had once been their departure points. They built fires from broken fence posts, cooked meagre meals on stove lids, used torn train schedules to wrap their feet. A young girl wrote in her diary that the station at Żabno felt like a place God forgot to finish. Elsewhere, the stations became archives of the unspoken. In Czechoslovakia, a line between small border towns known for its picturesque journey through the hills was never reopened. The tracks were cleared, the bridges reinforced, but no train came. Residents said they heard it once late one night in 1948, long after the war had ended, the cry of a steam whistle, the metallic hum on the rails. But no engine ever appeared. It was as if history itself had rehearsed a return, only to change its mind at the last moment. In some places, the ghost trains became a metaphor. Survivors referred to their experiences not by naming camps or soldiers or trains directly, but by referencing the journey or the line. A mother might whisper that her son left from the platform near the grain silo, never needing to finish the sentence. The image of the train, sealed, crowded, breathless, became too heavy to say aloud, yet too vivid to forget. The Hungarian poet, himself a survivor, once described a station outside of Nyíregyháza, where the trees had grown so thick over the tracks that they formed a canopy. He said the trains could no longer pass through, but the ghosts still did. He imagined them walking the rails at night, boarding and unboarding, luggage in hand, waiting for a conductor who no longer existed. During the Cold War, some of these stations were repurposed by the state. A few became militia outposts, others were used for storage, and one, in a village near Białystok, was turned into a children's library. The tracks behind it were sealed off with barbed wire. No one was allowed to ask why, yet the physical remnants remained. Steel embedded in soil, bolts protruding from concrete, timetables etched in rust, and above all the emptiness, not just of the trains that failed to return, but of the people who were never seen again after boarding. Generations removed from the event still feel it. In some families there are no photos, only rumours. He went east. She was on the third car. They said there'd be food on arrival. Modern rail workers sometimes come across strange anomalies. Stretches of track with no logical purpose, embedded in forests without towns nearby. Engineers call them deadlines. But for some, they are sacred. They represent not logistical failures, but memory in physical form. They ask questions no document can answer. Because the train in this war did not just carry soldiers or supplies, it carried decisions. The weight of choices disguised as timetables, the bureaucratic rhythm of catastrophe. And so we ask, if the tracks still exist but the trains do not, what exactly is it that remains? In the years after the war, governments focused on rebuilding what could be seen. The cities, the factories, the monuments. But no one rebuilt the ghost lines. They remained as veins without blood, tracing forgotten routes through fields and forests, carrying no sound but the creak of branches and the slow decay of metal. Their silence was a refusal, a warning, and in some places, a kind of grave. There was no ceremony to close them, no plaque was nailed to the crumbling platforms, no timetable marked the final departure. They were simply abandoned, left to the weather and memory. And yet, in their abandonment, they became more visible to those willing to see them, not as infrastructure but as testimony. Because these tracks had carried more than goods or passengers. They had carried systems of erasure, not just people in motion, but people removed. Not just logistics, but silence made physical. In Belarus, remnants of a narrow-gauge line once used to transport timber now weave between mossy pines. Few know it was rerouted in 1942 to serve a satellite labour camp. The lumber still moved. So did the prisoners. But when the war ended, the tracks were ripped up and never replaced. The earth, though, does not forget. The trench-like depression where the rails once sat still cuts through the landscape like a scar. Hikers sometimes walk it unknowingly, tracing the shape of a journey that never returned. Some ghost lines were quietly erased by time and trees. Others were buried intentionally, covered during new construction, paved over by roads, swallowed by development. In East Germany, officials feared the symbolism of certain routes and dismantled entire stretches, filing the iron for scrap and sealing records that tied stations to their wartime roles. But in villages whose only contact with the outside world had been a single passing train, the loss was permanent. The line wasn't just a connection, it was a lifeline, and when it vanished, so did part of the village's reason to exist. But not all traces were hidden. In Lithuania, a man named Tomas, who had been a boy during the war, spent his retirement rebuilding a section of track behind his house. not for trains but for memory. He laid salvaged rails with his own hands, even welded a replica sign that once marked the direction to Vilnius. "No train will come," he told a journalist, "but someone should still remember which way it went." Some efforts turned official. In Poland and Slovakia, museums were created along old routes. A single car was restored, its interior left untouched. Splintered floorboards, rusted brackets, and a bench too short for lying down. Visitors step inside and say nothing. No sign tells them what happened there. The air does. And even today, some rail lines that were once part of the deportation network are still in use. The steel replaced, the stations renovated, the history quietly folded beneath modern platforms. Commuters rush past, unaware of what once passed through, but in winter, when the frost settles on the tracks, old grooves reappear like wrinkles in the ground. Historians argue whether the tracks themselves were witnesses. After all, they are only tools, metal and wood, shaped by men, indifferent to passengers. But to stand on them now, in places where no engine has run for 80 years, is to feel something more than absence. It's to sense a path that refuses to be repurposed, an iron trail that does not forget. In the chaos of liberation, many of the train documents were destroyed, burned by retreating officers or buried in archives. But fragments survived. Not always in files, but in footnotes, in survivor testimonies, in the shape of a track that curves for no reason through an empty field. Even satellite images today reveal outlines, faint but insistent, of rails erased from maps but still imprinted in the soil. One woman, born in a camp but too young to remember it, returned decades later to where the platform had been. Nothing remained above ground, no station, no signage, just open grass. She closed her eyes and listened, not for voices but for rhythm, and in the hush of the wind she claimed to hear it. The low thrum of iron wheels moving over cold steel. Maybe she imagined it, or maybe some sounds never leave. They just go quiet, waiting for someone willing to hear. Because long after the train stopped running, and the clerks stopped filing, and the soldiers stopped guarding, the tracks still point in one direction. The question is, how far are we willing to follow them? By the time the final ghost trains were lost beneath moss and memory, another war had already ended. One fought not in trenches or across ruined streets, but inside the walls of country estates and prefabricated huts. It was a war of patterns, of pencil scratches and machine clicks, of steaming tea beside stacks of coded messages. At Bletchley Park, a once quiet manor hidden in the English countryside, the battle was not for ground but for understanding. And though no bombs fell here, its corridors pulsed with a pressure as real as the front lines. The workers of Bletchley didn't wear helmets or carry rifles. Most wore wool cardigans, sensible shoes, and worry beneath their eyes. They arrived by bicycle, by bus, or on foot, and they carried no medals, just pencils, clipboards, and the weight of 100,000 lives pressed between the lines of intercepted German transmissions. Because here, the war arrived not with explosions, but with messages, thousands a day, tumbling in by telegraph and wireless interception from all over Europe. And it was these messages the workers were tasked to break open, sort, translate, and send off again, sometimes within hours. Most never knew where their work was going. They only knew it mattered. The sprawling complex of Bletchley was made up of wooden huts, each assigned a number and a specialty. Hut 6 handled Army and Air Force codes. Hut 8 broke into the German Navy's secrets. Hut 3 turned cryptic German into plain English intelligence. The workers, often forbidden to even speak across hut lines, carried their assignments like secrets stitched into the hem of their uniforms. Many would never learn what the person beside them was decoding. It was safer that way. Most were young. University students pulled from Oxford and Cambridge under false job offers, or women recruited from typing pools, language departments, and even crossword competitions. They were told little. The job was clerical, administrative, until they arrived. And then, piece by piece, they were taught to swim through the ocean of enemy ciphers, to spot patterns in noise, to make meaning out of randomness. The days were long, 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, with no promise of recognition. In winter, the huts were freezing. In summer, they were stifling. The machines, especially the bombs, great hulking devices built to help decipher the Enigma code, thundered like factory engines, their rotors clicking through combinations in deafening repetition. Operators wore headphones to monitor the results, It was not glamorous, it was often dull, and yet in the silence between two clicks, history turned. At the centre of it all was a filing cabinet. Several, actually, rows of them, stretching down narrow corridors and tucked into back offices, packed with slips of paper, decrypted messages, analysis summaries, keyword notes, operator logs, cross-references, naval movement charts. These cabinets were the heart of the entire operation. If one went missing, if one drawer was mislabeled, entire convoys could be lost at sea. And so, a small army of filing clerks worked day and night, updating, sorting, organising, cross-referencing. Their job was to make sense of the noise, not to decode but to connect, to turn fragments into warnings. They were mostly women who had once dreamed of literature or nursing or travel. Now they handled lists of U-boat locations, Luftwaffe schedules, and orders marked Nur für den Dienstgebrauch, for official use only. They signed non-disclosure agreements written in language more cryptic than anything the enemy sent. Most never broke a single code themselves, but without them, nothing cracked could be acted upon. Each day began with the arrival of fresh intercepts, messages captured from listening stations across Britain and the Empire. Some were long, others just a few numbers. All were encrypted with the Enigma machine, or worse, the Lorenz cipher, a more complex, deeply layered system used for the highest level Nazi communications. The first job was to sort them by relevance, frequency, and known patterns. Some were immediately passed to the mathematicians. Others were filed for later, stored with hope that more pieces would emerge. Alan Turing worked just a corridor away from many of these filing clerks. He moved like a ghost, quiet, intense, lost in equations. But even he depended on the cabinet system. When a pattern was spotted, when a guess bore fruit, when the German Navy altered their settings, unexpectedly it was the clerical staff who documented the change and rewrote the catalogue. One misplaced sheet could delay an entire breakthrough, and delays meant death. A day too late decoding a U-boat schedule could result in the torpedoing of a supply convoy. A misfiled Luftwaffe report could leave a city exposed. Yet the people who carried this burden were told to say nothing, even among themselves. A woman once caught discussing her shift with a co-worker on the train was removed the next day. No explanation given. Just gone. The secrecy was absolute. Outside the park, no one knew. Families believed their daughters were secretaries or postal workers. One woman's father died, never knowing that she had helped locate the exact timing of the D-Day deception broadcast. A small task, filed in a thin folder, that redirected entire German divisions. She wept at his funeral, not just for his loss, but for the silence she still had to keep. They kept that silence long after the war. For years, Bletchley's existence remained classified. Only decades later did the stories begin to surface. And even then, most veterans spoke sparingly, if at all. By then, many of the filing cabinets had been cleared out, their contents sealed in national archives or lost to time. But some drawers still held secrets, scribbled notes, doodles, a lipstick stain on a decrypted message. Human traces pressed into the paper like breath. And so, in this war of wires and whispers, we must ask, what does it mean to win a battle you can never talk about, through a task no one ever saw, in a building that officially didn't exist? The corridors of Bletchley Park rarely echoed with applause. There were no parades, no battlefield medals pinned to uniforms, no headlines announcing the daily victories that took place inside its paper-stuffed rooms. And yet those victories accumulated, line by line, cipher by cipher, cabinet by cabinet, until they shifted the course of the war. Because every pattern noticed, every misprint caught, every correctly filed message had the power to either doom a convoy at sea or to save thousands. Somewhere between the monotonous clicking of the bombs and the quiet shuffling of filing drawers, lives were calculated. The women and men working the night shifts didn't always know the weight of what passed through their hands. A string of 6 numbers, a misplaced dash, a double encryption flag. But the intelligence officers did. They waited on the other end of the chain, desperate for even the slightest crack in the German codes. A 3-letter group repeated at odd intervals. A lazy typist on the German side using the same daily key. A weather report disguised as chatter. These were not mistakes. They were opportunities. The clerks were trained to recognize these moments, even if they didn't understand their full implications. One woman in Hut 6, barely 19, noticed a recurring phrase at the end of several messages, wetter klar, weather clear. At first, it seemed insignificant, but when cross-referenced through the filing system, slips hand-delivered, cross-indexed by date, location, and cipher variation, a trend emerged. These messages always preceded submarine activity in the Atlantic. It wasn't weather. It was code for attack readiness. That single realization changed the routing of Allied shipping for weeks. Bletchley was full of moments like that. Fragments passed through tired hands, filtered through countless drawers, only to surface as critical knowledge. The women in the registry rooms often handled hundreds of message slips per shift. They were trained to never read for meaning, only for structure. But structure was meaning, a shift in letter frequency, a change in operator behaviour. These could be signs of troop movements, naval deployments, even German fear. Turing's machine, the bomb, couldn't work alone. It needed a crib, an educated guess of what a message might say, to begin decoding. Finding these cribs was as much art as science. Clerks pored over incoming intercepts, scanning for place names, weather phrases, radio etiquette. They built profiles not of people but of habits, and habit in the world of ciphers was a fatal flaw. One of the least glamorous but most vital jobs was card indexing. Every name, location, ship or event, once identified, was added to a giant index system stored in rows of tiny drawers. The indexing staff worked with brutal precision, sorting entries by spelling variants, phonetic similarities, and abbreviations. Miss one, and an entire intelligence chain might be missed. Catch it, and the fog might clear just in time to redirect an attack. Still, much of Bletchley's work was done in isolation, surrounded by walls lined not with maps or battle flags, but filing cabinets. The war here did not explode, it accumulated, and those who bore its weight were ordinary people doing extraordinary invisible things. Tea breaks were brief, often silent. Social lives dissolved under the weight of secrecy. Marriages faltered. Some workers never even knew their spouses were employed in the same complex. Their assignments were simply too separated. One man worked in Hut 8 for 3 years, unaware that his younger sister sorted intercepts just yards away in the admin block. They discovered this only decades later, over dinner, when the veil of secrecy was finally lifted. But even in the discipline of Bletchley, human life crept in. A typist wrote a poem on the back of a decrypted message, tucked it into a drawer and forgot it. The junior clerk kept a tally on her desk of the messages she'd filed that ended in rescue. Another left flowers once a week beneath the main switchboard, in memory of a cousin lost to a U-boat 2 years before. Not everyone could bear the pressure. One codebreaker, after realizing that a delay in processing a cipher had likely resulted in an Allied ship being sunk, collapsed at his desk and never returned to Bletchley. Another woman requested reassignment after a decrypted message revealed the death of a family friend. Knew she couldn't act on, couldn't mourn publicly, couldn't even mention. The walls of the huts were thin, the weight of war was thick. The workers learned to whisper not out of secrecy, but from exhaustion, and yet they endured. Because somewhere beyond the filing cabinets and the endless streams of paper, they knew they were not decoding information, they were decoding outcomes, and still they couldn't speak of it. Not when Rome fell, not when D-Day succeeded, not even when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of whose paths through the war had first been traced inside those cabinets, in rooms that smelled of ink and wet wool. So the question lingers, when you win a war through whispers and wires, through clerks and codes, what part of that victory ever feels like yours? When the war finally ended, there was no ceremony at Bletchley Park, no medals pinned, no names read aloud. The final messages came in like the rest, coded, brief, impersonal, and the work stopped not with a cheer, but with a quiet clearing of desks. The bombs slowed to stillness. Filing drawers that had been opened and closed thousands of times were locked one last time. The workers, many of whom had spent years decoding the hidden lifelines of the war, were dismissed with little more than a handshake and a reminder. You're still not permitted to speak of this to anyone, and so they left. Some returned to universities, others resumed office jobs or raised families, but none could speak about what they had done. Even as parades unfolded in London and victory songs echoed through the streets, the Bletchley staff walked quietly among the crowds, watching strangers celebrate battles they had helped shape, operations they had safeguarded, lives they had helped preserve, all without a word. Decades passed before most of their work was declassified. By then, many had already died. Some went to their graves still believing they would be arrested if they ever admitted what they had done. Others, when the secrets finally lifted, still chose silence, not out of fear, but out of habit. Silence had become a part of them, like the way a code becomes invisible once you've stared at it long enough. Some shared fragments with family. A husband revealed over dinner that he'd once helped track Rommel's movements in North Africa. A grandmother casually mentioned she'd worked near Alan Turing, translating captured Italian naval codes. But often, even these stories were wrapped in understatement, offered not as grand revelations, but as afterthoughts, mumbled between spoonfuls of soup or folded laundry. Those who had filed the messages, the registry clerks, the indexers, the typists who maintained the fragile scaffolding of the entire operation, were rarely interviewed. History preferred its heroes dramatic and visible. But the truth was, Bletchley had been built on their shoulders. Without them, the intelligence would have crumbled under its own complexity. Without the endless rows of accurately filed decrypts, there would have been no connections, no crib matches, no breakthroughs. One former worker, speaking anonymously in the 1980s, said, "We lived in a world where one wrong folder could have sunk a fleet, and no one outside ever knew we were there." She kept a photograph of Hut 6 in a drawer behind her passport, not out of pride, but remembrance. Another, who worked nights managing cipher shift logs, said she sometimes dreamed in code. Long after the war, she would wake suddenly, convinced she'd missed a key intercept. Only when she saw her curtains, not blackout cloth but warm daylight, did she remember that it was over. Turing himself did not live to see the world acknowledge what had happened there. But those who had passed him in the halls, shared tea with him in silence, remembered. They remembered his quiet brilliance, his awkward grace, the way he scrawled numbers faster than anyone could follow. They remembered how the weight of his discoveries was never celebrated, only carried. Bletchley's buildings still stand. Some have been restored as museums. The bombs have been rebuilt. Tour guides walk guests through reconstructed huts, explaining how lives were saved one click at a time. But even in these reconstructions, something is missing. The sense of urgency, the bone-deep fatigue, the silence that wrapped itself around every decision. What's harder to exhibit is the feeling of walking home at sunrise, knowing you might have altered the day's outcome for thousands, and never being allowed to tell a soul. Because in that war, memory wasn't just what was preserved, it was what was withheld. In one surviving filing cabinet, a drawer labelled miscellaneous, not used, was found decades later. Inside were slips of paper, partial decrypts never fully solved, messages that had come too late to matter. Among them was one page with only a time, a grid coordinate, and the phrase, "Proceed as arranged." The page had no date, no context. It had never been filed properly. No one knows what it referred to, but someone, somewhere, had held it once, had stared at it in the fluorescent half-light, trying to decide whether it mattered. Perhaps it did, perhaps it didn't. That was Bletchley. So what remains of a war fought through cabinets and codes? Not monuments, not victory banners, but drawers of paper filled with patterns that once held the weight of the world, and the quiet, enduring knowledge that even the smallest action, the most unnoticed clerk, can turn the gears of history. Long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, long before the kamikaze flights and jungle ambushes and the American island hopping campaigns, Japan was already fighting a quieter, slower war, not with soldiers, but with spreadsheets. In Tokyo, in bureaucratic offices lit by yellow bulbs and fogged windows, men hunched over production charts and naval tonnage reports, calculating a problem that wouldn't go away. They didn't have enough steel, and worse, they didn't have the land to find it. Where Germany had coal and the United States had oil, Japan had ambition, but few raw materials. The islands themselves were poor in minerals, and every factory expansion, every military campaign required metal that didn't exist in the soil beneath their own feet. It was a structural deficit, one that no propaganda, no loyalty to the emperor could solve. Every warship built was an act of subtraction. Every tank ordered meant another machine left incomplete. The empire's arsenal was always mortgaged against the future. By the early 1930s, as Japan began expanding into Manchuria and Korea, the situation became more urgent. It wasn't just conquest, it was survival. Manchuria offered iron ore and coal. Korea brought labour and transport routes. But even with those gains, Japan was still reliant on imports, especially from the United States. Ironically, in the years before war broke out, American scrap metal shipments kept the Japanese industrial engine humming. The same metal that would later clash with US fleets in the Pacific had once arrived by boat from San Francisco and Seattle. But that flow was fragile. As tensions grew, Washington grew wary, and in 1940 the US imposed an embargo on steel and aviation fuel to Japan. The response in Tokyo was both pragmatic and desperate. They had to expand further, into Southeast Asia, into the Dutch East Indies, into territories rich in tin, bauxite, and especially oil. War became not just political, but economic. Each invasion was a map drawn in minerals, each battle a wager on access. The steel shortage shaped everything. Japanese tanks were lighter, thinner armoured, and mechanically simpler than their Western counterparts. It wasn't a design flaw, it was necessity. There wasn't enough high-grade alloy to build massive armoured divisions. Instead, they emphasised mobility, numbers, and psychological shock. But as the war dragged on, even these were difficult to maintain. Tanks were stripped for parts, damaged vehicles were cannibalised. In some cases, rusting pre-war models were welded back into service with bolts and optimism. Ships told the story more starkly. Japan had some of the most powerful battleships ever built, the Yamato and Musashi, towering giants of steel and firepower. But their very existence drained resources from the rest of the Navy. For every super battleship launched, there were dozens of smaller ships that couldn't be built or repaired. Escort vessels sailed with patched hulls. Submarines went out with known flaws. Welding seams were rushed. Shipyards operated under quotas that ignored physics. Engineers submitted reports they knew were lies. And when steel ran low, substitutes were used. Wood, concrete, bamboo. Entire ships were redesigned to use less metal. Some of Japan's late-war coastal defence boats were held together with plywood and tar. In one remarkable case, a training aircraft was constructed with fabric wings and a frame made from reconstituted paper pulp. The instructors joked that the plane flew on courage, but the joke wasn't funny for long. Soldiers in the field saw the shortages most painfully. Helmets were reused, dented and reissued. Rifles were stripped of accessories. Ammunition was rationed even during training. In Burma, troops ran out of replacement parts for their machine guns, forcing them to fire in shorter bursts to preserve barrels. In the Philippines, some units received no grenades, only instructions to charge Allied tanks with explosives tied to bamboo poles. Even bayonets were affected. Early war models were forged steel, sharp and balanced. By 1944, many were soft metal, too weak to hold an edge, prone to bending in combat. Soldiers hammered them straight on rocks, over and over again, until they snapped. Meanwhile, Japan's rail network, vital for moving troops and supplies, began pulling its own teeth. Railroad tracks were torn up and melted down to build guns. Steel doors were stripped from public buildings. Streetcars in Tokyo were decommissioned, their frames melted to support aircraft production. Families donated cooking pots and sewing needles to metal collection drives. The slogan was simple: one nail can save a life. But nails don't replace ball bearings. The munitions factories, stretched beyond breaking, began running 24-hour shifts, staffed increasingly by teenage girls, elderly workers, and conscripted labour from Korea and China. Accidents became routine. Quality dropped. Bullets jammed. Artillery barrels warped. Pilots reported planes arriving with engine bolts not properly tightened. One wrote in his diary, "The plane flies like it wants to leave its own skin." And yet, somehow, Japan kept fighting, because this was not just a war of fire and flight, it was a war of shortages, of forced creativity, of machines built from willpower and the leftovers of older machines. The factories screamed with effort and still produced too little. The front lines starved. But no one stopped. Not yet. Because as long as there was even a scrap of steel left, a bent bolt, a rail spike, a spoon melted into a trigger spring, someone, somewhere, would turn it into a weapon. So the question hung in the humid air. What happens when a nation fights not with what it has, but with what it no longer can afford to lose? As Japan's steel veins began to run dry, the war effort shifted into a strange and dangerous rhythm, one that relied less on strategy and more on improvisation. The Japanese Empire, now stretched across thousands of islands and supply lines vulnerable to disruption, became a machine devouring itself to keep moving. Steel was no longer just a material. It had become a myth, a symbol of dwindling power, and every remaining gram of it was guarded, melted, or reshaped with urgency bordering on desperation. By 1943, Allied bombing campaigns had crippled many of Japan's industrial zones. Steel mills in Osaka and Nagoya were reduced to rubble. Shipyards along the coast operated under blackout conditions, pushing half-functioning machines in unventilated hangars, using scrap metal collected from citizens to forge structural components that once required specialized alloy blends. There were no more standards, just survival. The scarcity transformed engineering culture. Military designers were forced to reinvent. Aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi were produced with simplicity as their primary feature, a one-use kamikaze plane that could be made quickly and cheaply, using unskilled labour and materials no longer fit for standard combat aircraft. It was ugly, heavy, and unstable, but it flew, and that was enough. It didn't have to return. Steel shortage even altered the design of defensive structures. Coastal gun batteries that would have once been fortified with reinforced concrete and armoured steel turrets were now protected with hollow logs, earth mounds, and salvaged sheets from bombed-out factories. Bridges were no longer reinforced but rebuilt as wooden constructs that could barely support the movement of tanks. Some were rigged to be destroyed behind retreating units, not because of strategic intent, but because they couldn't afford to maintain them. The home front reflected the shortage with increasing intensity. Civilians were urged to donate anything metal: kitchen knives, garden tools, coat hangers, even zippers. Schoolchildren walked through neighbourhoods collecting broken bicycle frames and lantern fittings. Toy manufacturers were banned from using any metal in production. Tin soldiers were replaced with papier-mâché dolls painted silver. Even musical instruments weren't safe. Bells were melted down, piano strings removed and repurposed, church gongs silenced for the war effort. And still, the need was not met. What little steel remained was funneled into three priorities: the Navy, the Air Force, and the expansion of military industries in Manchukuo, Japan's puppet state in northeastern China. There, forced labour was used to mine iron and coal under conditions so brutal that many died before completing a single year of work. The cost of each pound of steel was measured in human lives, and yet it was never enough. By late 1944, a new tactic emerged: hiding loss through propaganda. Reports of aircraft production included numbers that no longer reflected operational planes, but frames awaiting engines or weapons that didn't exist. Battleship repairs were logged as ongoing, even when yards had no material to complete them. Civilians were assured of production successes that were fictional, meant to hold morale together in the absence of material truth. In the field, frontline soldiers began encountering increasingly improvised weapons: grenades made with ceramic casings, landmines filled with black powder and scrap. In the Philippines, a unit of Japanese soldiers defended a beachhead using swords forged from rebar and railway ties. They weren't symbols of honour. They were the only available option. Even ceremonial items were stripped. In temples across Japan, ornate steel lanterns and gates were requisitioned and sent to be melted. In some cases, the sacred tools of Shinto shrines, bells, swords, reliquaries, were seized, smelted, and returned to battlefields as shrapnel or bayonet tips. The line between sacred and expendable blurred in the heat of the furnace. The Navy, perhaps more than any other branch, suffered visibly. The losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf had gutted the Imperial fleet. Replacement vessels, promised on paper, never made it to water. Steel intended for hull plating was redirected to aircraft or land defences. Eventually, even that stopped. Plans for new ships were shelved. The great floating symbols of the Empire had become too expensive to replace. One admiral, near the war's end, wrote privately that the Japanese Navy had sails made of smoke and decks made of prayer. He was not being poetic. Meanwhile, Allied forces, bolstered by nearly limitless industrial output, moved with logistical ease. American steel flowed in convoys, in Liberty ships, in endless rail cars. Tanks arrived faster than the enemy could destroy them. Aircraft were built with aluminum and chromium alloys produced in quantities Japan could only dream of. The imbalance was no longer military, it was elemental. And yet Japan continued to fight. Because surrender was unthinkable. Because to admit the absence of steel, to admit that the foundations of the war effort had corroded beyond recovery, was to admit defeat not just on the battlefield, but in the soul of the nation. Even as cities burned and civilians scavenged the ruins of bombed-out warehouses for wire and nails, the official line held, "We endure." But a nation cannot endure on memory and substitutes forever. When steel runs out, it is not just armour that fails, it is the story that collapses, the myth of invincibility, the illusion of control. And in Japan, that collapse came not all at once, but with every missing bolt, every grounded plane, every empty forge. So in the end, the real question may not be how long Japan fought, but how long a nation can survive when even its weapons begin to rust before they are ever used. By the summer of 1945, the steel shortage was no longer just a logistical dilemma, it had become a symptom of collapse. The empire that had once built towering warships and sleek fighter planes was now defending itself with hollow metal and burnt promises. Even in Tokyo, the heart of the empire, the war could be felt in every missing screw, every silent machine. Industrial silence had begun to echo louder than the sirens. In cities like Kure and Yokosuka, once proud centres of naval engineering, the dry docks stood half full, not because the ships had sailed, but because they had never been completed. Warship hulls sat rusting in the open air, some abandoned mid-construction, others stripped of anything salvageable. Engineers no longer consulted blueprints. They scoured scrap heaps, hoping to find a single usable beam. Welding torches flickered not with progress, but with futility. In the countryside, trains ran less frequently. Whole rail cars were cannibalized for their axles, couplers and underframes. Children walked to school on tracks with missing sections, stepping over gaps like spaces in a broken sentence. The Ministry of Transport had long since stopped issuing repair requests. The metal wasn't coming. The black markets thrived. In Osaka, a single usable bolt could be traded for rice. Bicycle chains became currency. Women carried broken appliances to alleyway smiths who promised to melt them down for the cause. Even ration cards were printed on metal-thin foil, symbolic gestures of national resolve that disguised how little remained underneath. Factories continued to operate, but they hummed with pretense. One worker recalled turning the gears of an empty assembly line, performing the motions because a supervisor was watching. Not because there was anything left to assemble. Assembly had become theatre. The machines were tired, the belts frayed, the screws stripped from overuse, and still production reports were submitted. Still, the slogans were chanted. "Endure through metal," they said, though metal had long since turned to dust. In schools, students were told stories of the empire's industrial strength, while the classroom roofs leaked and the iron desk legs bent under their own weight. Education became ideology. Practicality was no longer relevant. What could be taught when the furnaces were cold? By August, the skies over Japan were no longer filled with Zeros but with enemy bombers. The American B-29s arrived in formation, gliding above a nation that could no longer reach them. Anti-aircraft guns, once formidable, were idle. Ammunition had been depleted months before. The few remaining aircraft scrambled from makeshift runways, patched together with sheets of scavenged metal that buckled on takeoff. Pilots flew with nerves sharper than their plane blades, and many never returned. The steel Japan needed was now falling upon it from the sky. When Hiroshima was obliterated, there was no steel left to rebuild. The iron frames of streetcars melted into the streets. Railings curled like ash. In Nagasaki, the factories that had once smelted war metal into battleship hulls vanished in seconds, vaporized by a bomb built in a different continent, by a nation whose metal never ran out. And with those explosions, the illusion of industrial resilience disintegrated completely. But the truth is, Japan had lost its steel long before the bombs. It had lost it in the offices where engineers approved blueprints they knew couldn't be built, in the foundries where forges burned cold while output numbers rose on paper, in the shipyards where scaffolding outnumbered rivets, in the towns where children memorized patriotic songs while their homes collapsed from rot, and on the battlefields, where soldiers swung rifles without bayonets and marched with boots so thin they tore on coral stone. When surrender came, it came not just with a signature on a deck, but with the quiet knowledge that there was simply nothing left to fight with. After the war, Japan's recovery began not with reconstruction, but with sweeping. The clearing of twisted girders, collapsed bridges, rusted cranes. The country had to dig through its own wreckage before it could dream of rebuilding. And even then, the first factories reopened not to make tanks or ships, but pots, stoves, bicycles. The war had ended with steel turned into smoke. It would begin again with steel shaped into life. Today, visitors to Japanese war museums can still see what's left. Helmets too thin to protect, plain frames built of pine, and bayonets snapped clean at the hilt. Artifacts of a time when a nation tried to win a modern war without modern means, and paid for it in more than just defeat. And so the final question lingers in the quiet of those museum halls, beneath the flicker of dim light across dented steel. What happens to an empire built on ambition, when its last resource is belief? And even that begins to bend. The war had taken steel, oil and silence, but it was food that brought Japan to its knees. In the charred remains of once mighty cities, hunger now moved like a second enemy, invisible but more persistent than bombs. The empire's furnaces may have gone cold, but the human stomach burned on. And far from the factories and airfields, in the quiet fields of Okayama, a boy no older than 16 turned over soil with trembling hands, trying to keep his family from disappearing with the rest of the empire. His name was Tadashi, and he had once dreamed of being a pilot. Not for glory, but because flight meant freedom, and he had never left his prefecture. His older brother had been drafted 2 years earlier, and since then, Tadashi had become the man of the house, though no one ever said it aloud. He rose before dawn, tilled the land that was now mostly dust, and watered rice paddies with pails because the irrigation canals had cracked and failed. He was too thin for his bones, and so was his mother, but they never spoke of it. What they did speak of, often and with ritual, were ration books. These small brown slips were more sacred than scripture in those days. They dictated whether the family could afford a pinch of sugar, a spoon of salt, a few grams of barley. Sometimes Tadashi would stare at the stamps for minutes, wondering if he'd accidentally used one twice. The margins of the pages were greasy from his mother's fingers. She treated them like heirlooms, and in a way they were. Not because they held value, but because they held structure. And structure was a kind of survival. Letters arrived from his brother less and less frequently. When they did, they were read slowly. Tadashi would read the same paragraph 3 times, letting the words grow heavier with each repetition. The most recent one had no date. It simply read, "Still alive." 8 snow. That was all. No rank, no place. Just a trace of voice that made his mother weep when no one was watching. When the war turned bitter, urban families began sending their children to rural areas in desperate hope that country rice would spare them. Tadashi saw them walking down the dirt path past his field. City children in polished shoes now caked with mud, carrying tiny bundles of belongings and fear. Some were taken in by families, some were not. Tadashi offered a boy half his lunch one day, a cold, crumbling rice ball, and the boy cried while eating. That night Tadashi lied and told his mother he wasn't hungry. She didn't believe him, but she said nothing. Then came the draft notice, not for Tadashi, but for his mother, conscription of a different kind. The government had issued a mandate for all women under 50 to join the national factory effort. Even farmers were no longer exempt. She was to report to a fabric mill 3 towns away. The land would be Tadashi's alone now. When she left, she pressed both hands into the earth before stepping onto the train platform, whispering something Tadashi didn't hear. Days blurred into one another. The sky no longer changed. Rain came in ash. Tadashi wrote to his brother but received no reply. He wrote to his mother but feared she'd never see the letter. Instead, he began writing to someone else, someone unnamed. In pages he folded and hid in a cracked tin beneath a tree. He poured into those pages not just memories of what was lost, but descriptions of the land, how the soil had turned acidic, how the worms had vanished, how even the crows no longer circled. He wrote of his body, how his teeth ached, how his skin sagged at the joints, how his thoughts felt full of holes. Then came news from the nearby village. A bomb had flattened a neighbouring prefecture. It hadn't come from a plane, no warning siren, just light, soundless for a second. Then thunder and silence again. Rumours called it a new kind of fire. One man said he saw a woman turn to shadow on a wall. Tadashi didn't believe him, until the wind shifted. Days later, black rain fell on his field. It smelled like rust and burned his throat. He continued farming. When the surrender was announced, it came not with gunfire, but with a scratchy radio voice. The Emperor speaking for the first time in history. Tadashi didn't cry, he just kept digging. But that night he unearthed the tin beneath the tree, added one last page to his buried diary, and sealed it with a stone. He did not know who would read it, but he believed someone would. Because even in the absence of steel, of oil, of victory, of hope, the one thing the land still offered was memory. And somewhere in that soil Tadashi had planted something sacred, a record of survival not for the Empire, but for the quiet people who had fed it, even as it starved them in return.